Hello, and welcome to a podcast from the St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation for Freedom, Family, and Faith. This is Anne DeSantis. It's so great to be here with you for our 10 Saints series, part 2. And on this podcast, we are going to talk about St. Francis of Assisi. And so I'm pleased to have you join with us with my co host, Mickey Kelly. I'm going to bring him on. Mickey, it's wonderful to have you here with us.
Hi, Anne. It's great to be here once again.
That's right, and we have so much to talk about, and we have obviously, this one is our Families in Crisis podcast, and so we will be talking about St. Francis of Assisi. Mickey, before we start, I didn't know if you had any words that you'd like to share just on basic thoughts on the saint.
Well, Anne, I think there's what is there to say about St. Francis of Assisi? I mean, he was one of the great reformers of the church, and let's face it, the church was going through so much during his time. And I think there's one thing we have to understand too is that he gave up so much for the family that he gave up so much that eventually, like, there's like a virtue in the church that I think many people are not familiar with, and that is the detachment of this world. And that's something St. Francis of Assisi has done so well. And it's something we all can learn about. I consider like a type of like spiritual poverty. And also, he also was instrumental in the development of the Lenten practice that we have every year, the 40 day of like fasting, praying, and what have you, and of course, giving alms. That actually started the period between the Assumption to the feast day of St. Michael, who was somewhat, like the church knew at the time, but over the years, especially through St. Leo the 13th, he is someone that we came to know.
And here I am back on screen. I thought I'd just give some basic information for people who might not have some of those basic, pieces of information about St. Francis of Assisi, and that would be that his feast day is actually on October 4th every year. He was born in
10-4.
1181. Yes, and he died in 1226. He was born to a wealthy cloth merchant, and in his 20s, he took part in a war and was held prisoner for nearly a year. Shortly thereafter, he had several experiences that shaped his conversion, and he renounced his worldly goods and family ties to embrace a life of poverty. So, when you think about that, our audience here, or who are you watching, those families who are in crisis, how much you understand uh, crisis and how much he did understand it and how much he went through because he gave up everything so that he could follow Christ. And in the end, I think that's the goal of all of our lives, isn't it? That we do need to give up, everything that we have in terms of, we don't need to be poor and sell our homes and live out on the street. God's not asking us to do that, but we do need to give up our attachments, don't we? I didn't know, Mickey, if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, because don't you think it's a lot of it is about our attachments that we have to this world and to things and to pleasure and even to relationships sometimes.
Yes, and actually, it's in fact, you bring up some really good points. Detachment means not like but it's the I think it's if we look at in the Gospels, Jesus was when he was calling his apostles, one of the first things that he would tell them is, sell everything you have and follow him, so to speak. And of course, they had a choice to either do as he says or just keep attaching themselves to the world. But little did they know is that they were going to be called to something greater. And that is something St. Francis of Assisi kind of, carried on from like from the time of Jesus when when he gathered his first followers. And that in itself, and it's not just doesn't have to be about like detaching, from pleasure and everything. Well, you're still gonna need clothes for sure. Like, well, nobody does want to see you, you know, your whole human anatomy. If you, look at you, you don't want to be naked for sure, but I mean, you do need some. clothing, but not a lot of clothing, of course, because sometimes like you probably want to. There's gonna be clothes that you're not gonna wear for a long time, and next thing you know, it's like you don't want to be a hoarder, of course. People that have too many things, and every now and again they need to like get rid of it. And it's also too that it's good to have money, to pay the bills and have it, for emergency purposes. You need to pay someone to, fix a leak or fix a electric problem, whatever the case is. It's good to have that, for emergency's sake. But sometimes you have to ask yourself, like, do I really need all like millions or billions of dollars, or can I at least give it to those who are in need? Those are some of the things you have to ask yourself when you have all these possessions in the world. And St. Francis, set the standard for it. That's something like we need to follow, time after time as part of a practice called almsgiving, meaning giving alms, so to speak. You want to flip that around. Very common during Lent, but what we have to understand is it doesn't have to be reserved for Lent. We could do it all year round.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that when we really reflect on his life, that's what we learn about him is that through his prayer, through his sacrifice, and through his imitation of Christ, right? And he was able to do so much. And just some other basic information is that he is one of the most venerated figures in the Roman Catholic Church, and he founded the Franciscan order and also the Poor Clares. And he and Saint Catherine of Siena are the patron saints of ecology and of animals. A lot of people already know that. I'm sure that you are watching. Maybe you are a pet lover. Maybe you love your dog or your cat. And sometimes, every year at a lot of our Catholic parishes, we have those blessing of the animals. And a lot of those are in the name of St. Francis of Assisi. And let's face it, sometimes for people who are in crisis, some of those animals can be some of our best friends during a really rough time, whether it be your dog, your cat, or, whatever pet you own. But they can really bring a lot of healing sometimes. And so I don't know, Mickey, if you had anything to say about that, because I know you and I are both on that in that camp that we're both animal lovers too.
Well, and I think you really bring up a good point. I think something that well, first of all, you did bring up something in regards to ecology, and that's something that St. Francis, of course, is a patron saint of. And I think something that we have to understand is that, there's like a debate where, well, there's like a limitation as far as like pets. Like, let's face it, pets don't necessarily, carry on, the family, traditions or what have you. But I think if there's something that we can understand, it's like you mentioned, and is that pets do bring healing during some of the most difficult times. I do have memories of um, a cat that would comfort me during some of the roughest times, like when I was going through grade school. And there's also times where I had another cat that would be willing to greet me as I was coming home from work, school, travel, dates, whatever the case is. And then there will be a dog that will be willing to greet me as I walk in the door from running errands, shopping, whatever the case is. But you do bring a point that pets, time after time, you know, the right pet would, help you cope with some of the, s- I would say, the chaos of what brings forth, that we encounter like in our everyday life.
Yes, it's good to echo that, I think, because I'm sure that people who are watching this podcast are thinking the same thing in terms of when you think of St. Francis of Assisi, you can't help but think of the animals. And when we say to ourselves, like, where does that tie into what we do as a foundation? And the way that it ties it in is the fact that, as Mickey and I just said, a lot of times pets can offer that solace. I know we have 2 cats in my house, and how many times when I'm feeling a little bit low that my cat will come up right next to me and, make me just feel a little bit more accompanied, right? So, it's just something that we can think about. And we always wanna talk to you, our audience, because, the reason that we do this podcast is for you, and it's for you who are in some kind of crisis, whether that be something to do with divorce or separation, health crisis, marriage problems, relationship problems, job loss, loss of a loved one. I mean, the list goes on, doesn't it? And so it was Mickey's idea, actually, that we do this whole idea of bringing these saints that you can intercede to, learn a little bit more about them. And so that was a big part of our purpose in doing that. And now looking at this article, I'm just looking at this biography. It is online of St. Francis of Assisi, and it is coming to us from biography.com, which is a simple website. But I'm just going to read a little bit more of some of the things that I think are pertinent for us to unpack. And it says in the beginning that he abandoned a life of luxury for a life devoted to Christianity after reportedly hearing the voice of God, who commanded him to rebuild the Christian church and to live in poverty. He is the patron saint, as we already said, for ecologies. Now, he also had the stigmata, and it says in this article that later in life, Francis reportedly received a vision that left him with a stigmata of Christ, marks resembling the wounds of Jesus Christ. He suffered them, and when he was crucified, making Francis the first person to receive such holy wounds. He was canonized on July 16th, 1228, although we know his feast day is October 4th. During his life, he also developed a deep love of nature and animals and is known as the patron saint of, as we said, environment and animals. His life and words have had a long renaissance of millions of followers across the globe, and each October, many animals around the world are blessed on his feast day. And so there's a lot more to talk about with him other than just his love of animals. The other thing, as we said at the beginning of the podcast, was that he willingly gave up his riches. I mean, think about in our world how much people are drawn to things. They are drawn to beautiful things, new homes, new cars, new friends, new everything. And for Francis, he made a conscious decision that it was more important to serve God and more important to serve those in need. And, a lot of times, me as the executive director for the foundation, when people ask me, like, how can I be healed? How can I find happiness? And, you know, happiness is never a magic wand, I don't think. But I do think one way we can find happiness is through service. And that is exactly what Francis did, is that he gave his life in service. Now, should we also mention that the Holy Father is also, took his name as saying Pope Francis, right? And so I didn't know if Mickey, we wanted to unpack that, talk about that a little bit, and how there's some kind of, obviously, Pope Francis has some kind of a devotion to him.
And I think you bring up a really good point because for the first time in the history of the papacy, Francis is taken. And some of the John's been the common name for the longest time, along with Benedict and Pius, so to speak. And of course, Paul was like at a very distant third. And I believe Gregory also is around there too. So, but they're like the top four names chosen, for popes. But I think you bring up a very excellent point is that, 10 years ago, actually, we all recall the resignation of Pope Benedict, of the late Pope Benedict now late Pope Benedict XVI. And you had that 2 week of suspense, like who is going to succeed him? Long stepped forth Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio, who would actually take the name St. Francis as Pope. And now we know him today as Pope Francis. And one thing that we have to, like, one of the things that Pope Francis mentioned on why he chose it is because he saw it as an opportunity to reform the church. And that's something I couldn't agree more, especially with what the church has endured for the last, at the time, 40 years ago, with the scandals, with the decline in mass attendance and the shortage of priests and what have you. And I think one of the things Pope Francis wanted to do to carry on the tradition that was brought forth from Pope Francis is to reform the church and also bring it back to its roots. And some of the things the Pope has done was he set aside a place, like he bought like an abandoned building and turned that into like a shelter for the homeless. That's one of the things he has done. The other is sell some of the possessions of the that the Vatican had, and use that money for to help those that are unfortunate, which I thought was really one of the probably one of the boldest things you could ever do when you have the title of Holy Father. I mean, the list goes on and on too, and that's I think that's something that we could all learn. Like there are times, I mean, I kind of wish that some of the richest and most powerful people in the world could put some of their wealth towards helping those who are less fortunate. And granted, too, I understand they have their reservations, so to speak, because some of them are probably on drugs and they may be taken advantage of, so to speak, to the point where they could have gone broke or what have you. Yeah, I mean, I could understand those things, but of course, we still have to discern. Like, okay, maybe I should, I mean, you know, I think we should still like use a discernment process. Okay, should I take this person or not? That's where your decision comes in. Be you know very careful too. I mean, let's face it. I mean, there are people that are living on the streets, and you just wish that if all the sky rises just around them, especially in Philly. Like you would think there should be like a couple floors set aside for those that are less fortunate to help them get back on their feet, or eventually, for them to like get their act clean and eventually get a job and within a year or two, get their own place and all that fun jazz. So
Yeah, yeah. And it's funny, I was just thinking as you were speaking too that this podcast is being aired in late September, so it's just in time for St. Francis of Assisi's feast day. And so I just want to ask you who are watching this podcast, please share it with somebody because it's perfect timing to celebrate that feast day and educate people a little bit more on St. Francis of Assisi. You can never learn everything just through one method. Like you're not going to learn everything about St. Francis of Assisi on this podcast, but you will learn ways that you can intercede to him more because what our mission is, like as I repeat over and over, is that outreach to families in crisis, and reading this article that I was referring to a little bit earlier was talking about war and imprisonment and how Francis was affected. And I'll just read a little bit of what this says so that we can talk about it. It says that Francis and the men of Assisi came under heavy attack, and in the face of superior numbers, they took flight. The whole battlefield was soon covered with bodies of butchered, mutilated men screaming in agony. Most of the surviving Assisi troops were immediately put to death. Unskilled with no combat experience, Francis was quickly captured by enemy soldiers, dressed like an aristocrat and wearing expensive new armor. He was considered worthy of a decent ransom, and the soldiers decided to spare his life. He and the other wealthy troops were taken as prisoners, led off to a dank underground cell. Francis would spend nearly a year in such miserable conditions, awaiting his father's payment, during which time he may well have contracted a serious disease. Also, during this time, he would later report he began to receive visions from God. Now, I just read a little bit of that, but we're talking about crisis here. And think about that. I mean, the fact that he suffered so greatly at the hands of war, I mean, that's got to be one of the worst things that you can go through in your life. And so maybe some of you who are watching this podcast are affected by, some type of war, or you have some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder too. That's another crisis, isn't it? So let's just talk about that a little bit because he really did understand what it meant to be scared, frightened, and also to pray to God for help. So Mickey's coming on here in a second. We'll talk about that.
yes, and I think you bring up a really good point. I think sometimes we kind of overlook that fact that Saint Francis actually before he founded what I like to call the Catholic Jedi, the Franciscan order, of course. They wear those brown robes. And I always remember every time people watch like every Catholic nerd out there that watches Star Wars, they always associate Obi-Wan Kenobi with Padre Pio. And I really get the reference right there too, because he's old and wise and what have you. But I digress. I think one of the things that we also have to understand, if like with Saint Francis, I think he could be also a powerful intercessor for those who were captives, and I think that's the case for him because he was an experience. He was inexperienced, and that's why the his captors had the upper hand in the victory with battle. And let's face it, I mean, PTSD wasn't a known thing until sometime after World War II. And you know, there were those that fought in the Korean conflict, Vietnam, the war on terrorism, Persian Gulf, you name it. And even those in the special missions groups like Green Berets, Navy SEALs, Rangers, et cetera, et cetera. They would actually endure some of the problems that we see today. And it's unfortunate that and most of the and there are times here and there, like when I'm wandering around the city, some of the homeless people are those that are veterans, and it really breaks my heart. And most of those guys are probably like around my dad's age, perhaps a little younger, but it still hurts me that those that served our country and put everything on the line, they have to be mistreated by those that are elected to public office and what have you. I think that's something we need to do. But thankfully, we're getting a little better, but like I know it's not going to be like a magic wand where it improves overnight or what have you. But I mean, I don't think we have to rely on politicians to address the issue. I think it also relies to us because every so often we do have to do things for the common good. It doesn't have to be on the shoulders of politicians, what have you. But I think St. Francis could be a good intercessor for any veterans suffering from PTSD. And let's face it, there's quite a bit of them out there. And there's an alarming statistic that 22 veterans commit suicide a day, and it's very unfortunate that something like that could happen to those that gave it all.
Yes, 100%. And I have to say, as the executive director, I don't think we have talked about this issue, this crisis. It really is a crisis of those who are suffering from PTSD, and maybe even because of former experience as a veteran and what they witnessed and some of the things that they still go over in their minds over and over again, that can be so difficult on a daily basis. And it doesn't just affect them, it affects their wives, their kids, people they know, people of their parents, other relatives, because it is a very stressful thing for their family. So I think we always need to keep that in prayer, as people of faith, as those people who are affected by war or poverty, as Mickey talked about, the homeless. And I think St. Francis of Assisi is a really super saint to intercede to in that way. And on the note, going back to animals and just talking about them, because many people who lose a dog or a cat, that can be a difficult thing for some families, can it? And especially for the kids too, for the children in the family. And so when you intercede to Saint Francis of Assisi, that's a way to bring healing for your family. I mean, and some people might say, well, the loss of a pet, maybe that's not as big of a crisis as some other things, right? Some of the other things that we talk about, but nevertheless, it can be a crisis for some. So before we end, Mickey, I just didn't know if you wanted to talk about that too, because you and I have both experienced that.
Yes, and I think one thing that I actually would also like to say too, I think also going back to the note we mentioned about PTSD, I think one of the most amazing things now is that there are some dogs that are being trained to detect the symptoms of PTSD. And I think that has been a difference maker for many of these, veterans who carry the invisible wounds, I like to call it. You see you could definitely see the physical stars, like they lose a limb or they're like in a wheelchair, so to speak, disabled. But it's another thing because also too, like in our culture, kind of downplays mental health. I mean, I know we're getting a little better with it, and it's a good sign, but I think there needs to be more to be done. And now, like we have, there's some programs out there for veterans. I'm sure we can Google search it. I don't want to devote too much of that on our episode here, but I just want to encourage Well, first of all, I want to say to all those who served our country, thank you for your service. I come from a family of veterans, and I once discerned military service myself, but I think God had another plan for me, and that's all right. That's all right. He always has a plan for everybody, no matter what. But the one thing that I would like to say is, if you are a veteran who are suffering from PTSD, first of all, reach out, talk about it. Don't hold it in, because I can assure you it's going to tear you up inside. Believe me. And also take advantage of programs where you can actually have a canine companion that can make a difference in your ongoing therapy to heal mentally from PTSD. And on the
What a
note
great
too,
tie-in,
if I could
Mickey.
also say,
Yeah,
and
please.
right, if I could also add too, like, don't be afraid to adopt. It's okay. And also, Pope Francis reminds us too to encourage people to have children. But he, like, I mean, it better have more kids than pets. But always don't hoard on pets. But I mean, just get a dog and a cat. Especially those that can get along pretty well. And get some of the like some of the breeds that I would recommend would be Labrador, golden retrievers, because they can be very playful, especially if you have like small kids, are very friendly. But if you're the type that likes to have your children protected, especially if you're like in a very sketchy part of town, and I had a great uncle that was a very big champion of this, um, go for like a German Shepherd, because they're very good in instinct, to protect, children. Like, they have that intuition that would protect them from potential harm. Those are my top three breeds right there.
I just want to say, what a great tie-in. Honestly, that's how the Holy Spirit worked on this podcast, because I wasn't thinking about that whole tie with pets and animals, and as you said, good companions for people who need that healing, especially veterans or other people. So great advice, Mickey. Mickey, thank you so much for coming back again, and we're looking forward to next month.
Thank you, Anne.
To all of you, I would say please do join us next month for our Families in Crisis podcast. This is our 10 Saint series. Come join us for our next episode. We're looking forward to seeing you then, and learn more about us by going to nonnatus.org. God bless. Thank you. The St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation for Freedom, Family, and Faith was founded in 2015 by the Mercedarian Religious Order with a mission to make pastoral outreach to families in crisis. The friars came together after attending the World Meeting of Families in Philadelphia with hopes of creating a foundation which could help those families and individuals who have faced tough times and need to know that the church cares and is there to help. Since that time when we were founded, the foundation has helped hundreds of families by offering prayer, priestly consultations, podcasts and videos, and programs and events. Whether it is something to do with divorce or separation, trauma, job loss, loss of a loved one, relationship issues, or other crisis, the foundation has seen lives transformed through the services we provide. Pope Francis has referred to our world as a field hospital, where there are a great deal of individuals and families who feel abandoned, and they need the special outreach of those who truly care and wish to show the face of God to others. As a foundation, that is what we do every day, and we're grateful to people like you who help to make a difference for families in crisis. Please pray for us and for our mission. Would you consider a one-time or recurring gift? Please go to nonnatus.org to donate. Thank you sincerely from all of us at the St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation for Freedom, Family, and Faith.